I think what we have today is an elite that denies they're an elite that denies the power, the privileges that they've got.
Hello and welcome to Offscript. My name is Stephen Edgington. Are the culture wars already over? To discuss her new book, How Woke Won, I'm joined by the commentator and head of education and culture at the think tank Policy Exchange, Dr. Joanna Williams. Thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us. If woke has already won, should we give up the fight?
No, definitely not. The reason why I called my book How Woke Won is because I really want to highlight the extent to which woke thinking has come to dominate so many of our major institutions, from the civil service to the police force, the judiciary, education, especially right the way through from nursery through to universities. But I don't think that means that it's not worth pushing back against it. And hopefully what I'm trying to do with my book is to shine a spotlight on how corrosive an impact woke thinking is having on all of these institutions, and really lift the lid on what's going on and allow people kind of insight into how this process has come about and what the impact is. And I think history really shows us in recent years that whenever people come to be aware of the impact that woke thinking is having, they don't like what they're seeing. And democracy is often the best disinfectant, and means people really challenge and push back against it, often very successfully.
Where does the word woke come from? And is there sort of a straight line from its origins to its contemporary phenomenon?
No, that's a good question. So the word woke actually, in its political sense, really originated in America about 100 years ago in the pre-civil rights era. And it was almost like a whispered warning from one black person to another to alert them to the fact that there were police officers about, or genuinely racist people who were out to lynch mob for them. I mean, this was the era of the Ku Klux Klan and very horrible, racist, violent acts. And it was a warning for people to kind of be on guard to protect themselves against potential violent acts. But it kind of morphed from there into a much more general and political meaning of kind of beware of inequality, be awake to social injustice. And really just shortly into the 2000s, this became appropriated by movements such as Black Lives Matter in this more general political sense. And you go back to around kind of 5-6 years ago now, and woke became almost a very, very popular word on the left. People were quite keen to identify themselves as being woke. They were quick to point out that all this meant was being alert to social injustice, that it meant you also kind of very politically correct. You had a heightened sense of what it meant to be a good person, to be anti-racist, to challenge homophobia and transphobia. People were very proud to be associated with this word. You had newspapers like The Guardian and even The Times publishing guides, particularly for kind of adults, people of an older generation, on how to be more woke. Or you had your kind of online magazines publishing kind of vox pop style lists of how being woke can make men hotter and this kind of thing. And unsurprisingly then, people who were critical of these ideas took this word and used it back against people. You know, you're calling yourselves woke, you are woke. And clearly people who are woke didn't like it when the word that they had adopted got turned back against them and used essentially as an insult. So I would say over the past kind of 5 or 6 years, woke's become very much a political football. It's been played with by both the left and the right. With the left at various times, they either claim ownership of it, and they claim it doesn't mean anything at all other than just being alert to social injustice, which is, I think, very, very disingenuous and dishonest of them to imply that. And the right using the word as an insult against them.
You say that it's an American phenomenon originally. How much is that the case today? How much has it spread to sort of the Anglosphere and beyond, if you look at France, Germany, other Western countries?
I think there's kind of 2 layers to that question. I think as a phenomenon, I think it spread very, very widely within the UK. Like I said, not necessarily amongst the general population, but certainly among a kind of elite managerial professional class that dominates, like I say, particularly the public sector, but increasingly within the private sector as well, the kind of institutions that run our country. I think that's very dominant in the US and in the UK. And I think to some extent it's begun to reach into other countries within Europe as well. I don't think to quite such an extent, but it's certainly beginning to get its toe in other countries, if you like. The word, however, I think is something which people are increasingly familiar with. I think that you've got two separate things almost going on. You've got the growth of policies and ideas being put into practice, and you've got the growing understanding of the label of the word and what the word means. And I think that's people are just beginning to get much more of a sense of the word and what the word means.
Now, you talked about left and right and how they interpret woke in different ways. Now, many people on the right have seen this woke movement, or do see it, as a distinctly Marxist movement with its origins within Marxism. And I know that you write for Spiked, and there are many people on the left who would say, well, maybe I'm a Marxist and I'm anti-woke. So how Marxist is this movement?
Well, you see, I don't think it is Marxist at all. And one of the things I really tried to take up in my book is why I don't think that woke has anything whatsoever to do with Marxism. And just to kind of come up with a few reasons for that. I mean, for one thing, Marxism for me is inherently linked to a sense of class politics, of a kind of distinction between, to put it very crudely, a kind of bourgeoisie that owns the means of production and the mass of working class people who sell their labour power to make a living. And it seems to me that most woke thinking is fundamentally at odds to that. Woke is very hostile, it seems, to not only working class people in general, but even the whole idea that class is the fundamental deciding point, determining factor, if you like, of what your position is in society. Woke thinking is much more comfortable with identity politics, of splitting people up according to their gender, their race, their sexuality, all these different kind of identity groups, rather than the more fundamental principle of class. So according to woke thinking, you can be kind of at the most oppressed people, in the most oppressed group in society on the basis of your skin colour and your sexuality, even if your parents happen to be kind of incredibly wealthy and you might have all this inherited wealth, you can still be considered very, very oppressed. And to me, that completely turns Marxism on its head. It doesn't have any kind of faith in working class people, and it doesn't see class as being the fundamental determining point of what goes on in the world. In fact, one of the points I make in my book is that woke thinking actually shores up the privilege, if you like, of the most elite sections of society. It allows them to appropriate the kind of genuine disadvantages experienced by lower class people, working class people. And it allows them to kind of keep those disadvantages for themselves, or pretend that they experience all these disadvantages too. It allows them to even kind of construct this language, this set of principles, these kind of words that single off and kind of mark their group out as being somehow superior to everybody else.
Do you accept there are similarities between the woke movement and Marxists and Marxism? So, for example, that people might argue that the class system has simply been replaced with what you talk about there, the identity system. So, there's an oppressive identity, let's say white men, and there is the oppressed, which are sort of minority groups and essentially anyone who isn't a straight white man. And people also argue that it's a similar sort of revolutionary movement, and both Marxists and woke people would, let's say, for example, hate similar things, hate the sort of history of Britain, or hate our institutions and want to replace them with their own sort of, year zero, new versions, new forms of society. So it's a revolutionary movement, and they've simply replaced class with identity.
Mm-hmm. I think there's some truth in what you're saying there. I mean, particularly I would draw parallels, I guess, with Maoism in China. When you look at lots of the trends that became apparent with the Cultural Revolution, the kind of the shaming of individuals, the ritualistic forms of apology, the way that children in particular were manipulated to teach older people a lesson and to spread and disseminate within society a distinct set of values that was aligned with the dominant thought of the Maoist regime. I would certainly see an awful lot of parallels there. And I think that's not just kind of wishful thinking. You know, these parallels were made quite explicit if you look at what was going on within sections of the left, particularly in the 1970s, and France often comes back down to French intellectuals. There were kind of exchange trips going on between the kind of French left elite and China and Mao, and these lessons were being learnt quite explicitly and taken back and adopted by left-wing movements in the West. So I think there are some very, very explicit and interesting parallels to be drawn in that way. But I guess my stumbling block is that even though I totally take on board what you're saying about lots of the language and lots of the surface features of Marxism being used in quite similar ways, I think it's just been twisted beyond all recognition, so that oppression doesn't even have the same meaning nowadays, even though the same words are used. Oppression is used in both instances. It doesn't have the same meanings that it would have done. That word doesn't even mean the same as it would have done 50, 60, 70 years ago, when it was very much tied in with this understanding of social class and the relationship that working class people in particular had to the labour market. I think that really is something quite distinct from the more general way that woke people today can talk about oppression. But I think, to me, the most fundamental point is the way that woke thinking seems to emerge from a real contempt for working class people. If you look at, particularly, I think this has been very, very explicit since 2016 and the vote for Brexit, the vote for Trump, you know, woke has almost taken off in the wake of this kind of real disgust, for want of a better word, of working class people. You know, they're all racist. They're obese. They can't look after their children properly. You know, they're all sexist, transphobic, homophobic. You know, they're gammon. All these insults. It seems sections of the woke left are very, very happy to throw at working class people. Whereas for me, Marxism is fundamentally a movement that would support working class people. When we talked of revolution as Marxists, it was about upturning the class system and putting working class people on top. If you have no faith in working class people, if you have just contempt for working class people, you don't want to do that. It's actually about keeping working class people in their place at the bottom of the heap and creating this new professional class of a kind of woke elite.
We could go very far down the Marxist sort of rabbit hole, and I could come back and say, well, actually, working class people generally don't support Marxism, and the impact of Marxist regimes isn't fantastic for working class people or anyone else. But anyway, let's not do that. I want to focus on the French issue very briefly, though, because that was an interesting point you made. I know that many of Mao's contemporaries in the early 1920s went to France, as you say, and were sort of educated there, which is absolutely fascinating. And there's also people who argue, such as Jordan Peterson, that many of these woke ideas came from French philosophy, Foucault and others. And this has been interpreted in sort of American universities and sort of exported back to Europe. And I know that many Europeans hate this idea that wokeism comes from France, especially if you speak to French people. They say, no, this is an American phenomenon or whatever. So how much can we blame the French for the woke movement?
I'm always keen to blame the French for no, not really. I think it's a tricky question. You know, it is a very, very tricky question because clearly, again, a bit like how you can draw some superficial parallels with Marxism, I think you can trace one line of thinking of where have these ideas originated from, particularly in the sense of privilege and identity. The other big thing that I think is very dominant in woke thinking more broadly is this obsession with language, obsession with words, with using the right words, of the language changing very, very rapidly. And each time it changes, some of us kind of miss out and we fail to keep up. And then we're kind of excluded from the woke club because we haven't kept up with the latest terminology. So I think the obsession with identity, the obsession with language, all of those things can really be traced back to what was going on in French intellectual thought in the 1960s and 1970s. But at the same time, I think it would be a mistake to think that all the people who are now currently working in our schools or universities, not in critical theory dominant departments, people who are in our civil service, it's not like they're all sitting down at the weekend kind of reading Foucault and Derrida and kind of really imbibing all of this thought and thinking, I can't wait to get back to work on Monday to really put kind of Derrida's thought into action. I mean, Foucault, I think, would actually be quite challenging or push back against some of the kind of excesses of woke thinking. There's some kind of fairly positive ideas that emerge from Foucault. So I think you can't just blame what's gone on in the academy and you can't just blame French intellectuals. I think it's very much how, not just a question of how this has been interpreted, but how it's been interpreted and put into practice and how this has played out in conjunction with broader political trends that have happened within the US and the UK at the same time. I think France does have a much stronger tradition of kind of protest, if you like, if you look at the Gilets jaunes. And I think for that reason, some sections of French society, at least, have had to take much more account of kind of where the general population of the country is at and what they're thinking. Whereas perhaps in this country, within our institutions, the elite have been able to run a bit more, become a bit more dominant, have things their own way, become a bit more comfortable in their position without the perception of that threat coming up from underneath.
Now, this word woke and the sort of phenomenon itself has been studied hugely in the last few years. We've had these culture wars, of course. And to me, the word woke is so cliched and overused, and people could probably play a drinking game in this interview and be very drunk at the end of it, based on the amount of times we say the word woke. But I just wanted to know why you actually wrote this book. There's so many books on wokeness at the moment. What was your sort of reason behind it? What was your sort of origin? I guess you wanted your own original take on it.
I did, but it also just ties together a lot of things that I've been thinking about over a number of years. So as far back as kind of 2016, I think, 2015, 2016, I wrote a book about academic freedom. I've been very interested in free speech and how free speech is restricted. And the title of that book is Academic Freedom in an Age of Conformity, and kind of how threats to free speech don't just necessarily come from authoritarian laws or kind of outright bans on what we can and can't say, but actually emerge from a groupthink as well. How when youngsters go to university, for example, they become aware of a kind of dominant consensus in relation to particular issues, and they become aware that if they speak out go against the grain of this dominant consensus on campus, they might not be kind of expelled. There may be no laws or rules or anything that they've broken, but the weight of social pressure to come back in line and say what the majority think can be quite overwhelming. So I've been interested in that. And then I wrote a book about feminism as well, kind of critical of many of the trends in modern feminism. And it seems like woke thinking, one of the things that most concerns me is the kind of soft authoritarianism that lies behind it. This idea that there is a consensus, a moral consensus that's forming. And I actually think it is important that we can name that consensus and name this kind of thinking that's emerging. And I think one of the reasons why many people object to the word woke is precisely because they don't like having this kind of body of ideas called out. It's much better if it can pass off as just being normal. This is just what all common sense, right thinking, as in good thinking people believe. And of course, everybody is anti-racist, anti-sexist. And of course they are. But what woke means is a particular approach to being anti-racist that's grounded in identity politics. And it really suits woke people if we think that this is just normal and not a one particular way of viewing the world. So I kind of like the word woke because it upsets people who are woke, and they would prefer that we didn't use any kind of label to identify a coherent, or what seems to be becoming a coherent body of thought.
Now, one person who thinks that wokeness is normal in a way, and not in a good way, is Ed West. And he makes a really interesting argument. I'm going to quote from an article he wrote recently, and I want you to respond. So he says, "This is not some dark new age of cancel culture. However, it's a return to normality. Those who grew up in the late 20th century were living in a highly unusual time, one that could never be sustained. A sexual and cultural revolution that began in 1963 or 1968. But it has ended, and as all revolutionaries must do after storming the Bastille, they have built Bastilles of their own." So is wokeness a natural phenomenon in which a dominant group of people within society controls the narrative, as it were, is able to censor their opponents? And, for example, Ed argues that this existed in, sort of the 1960s and before, but there was a conservative majority and a conservative consensus there. So, is wokeness really just getting back to normality in society, and the last 50 years have been an exception rather than the rule in terms of openness and free speech and debate?
Well, I can certainly see some of the logic to what Ed is arguing there, but I also think there are some very crucial differences as well. And to me, one of the things that strikes me about the woke elite that we have at the moment is that they deny the power that they possess. I think in other eras, if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, certainly we have always had in one form or another, most societies have an elite, a professional elite, or however you want to call it, a kind of upper class or an aristocracy or a professional elite. But I do think a number of things have changed. Like I say, I think partly in the past, people were much more upfront and explicit about that, and everybody, particularly under, say, go back as far as feudalism, it was very, very clear the rank order that everyone possessed. I think what we have today is an elite that denies they're an elite that denies the power, the privileges that they've got. And I think that is something quite distinctive and quite different for us to get our heads around. I think I'd mean it in far more than just a rhetorical sense. I think it makes it far more difficult for people who are not part of that elite to be able to identify and push back against the power that other people have over their lives. But I think also there are other more fundamental differences as well. I think the role that universities play in turning out a graduate class, the times that Ed's referring to, if you go back 50, 60 years ago, you were looking at well under 10% of the population going to university. So the group of people that were kind of in charge, if you like, either weren't graduates or weren't all graduates, or many of the people, you could work your way up into those positions without having had that benefit of the university, of having been to university. The differences, if you like, between somebody who was a manager and somebody who was a worker didn't seem quite so immense as the people today. There may have been a difference in salary, but there wasn't a moral difference. I think just the final point I'd make on another difference that I think is that, we've talked for a number of years now about the impact of social media, of putting people into bubbles. So again, this is something that didn't exist 50, 60 years ago. and how the kind of social media can have this effect of us making contact with people who are of a similar view to us. And so you think that your view then is the dominant view because you can kind of curate your social media news profile to only get people who reflect back to you what you already think. You know, that's one thing. I think it's something that should perhaps concern us more than it does. But what really bothers me is how I think this notion of the bubble of the like-minded has extended way beyond that. So again, go back 50, 60, 70 years ago, most children in the country would have gone to their local school. They would have gone to the school that was within walking distance. You know, now it's a much bigger thing for parents to choose the school that their child goes to, and they're choosing a school which aligns with their particular values. They move house to a street where people obviously have similar level of income to them. That prices out people who can't afford to live in those areas. Geographical areas, institutional positions, schools, all become colonized by people who think in the same way. So I think we've always had elites, but I think more than ever before, our elite today is more out of touch, if you like, with the way that the rest of the people in society live than ever before, and is also denying the very fact that they are in this elite position.
But you also argue that they're not only denying their being the elite, but they go so far as to say that they are actually the oppressed minority, and they cloak themselves within the language of oppression, and they present the masses as the oppressors. So can you expand a bit on that theory?
Definitely. So, I mean, this is where the beauty of identity politics really comes into play, because it allows people who perhaps may be very wealthy, but I think the whole kind of nature of wealth has changed, and our understanding of wealth has changed as well, where money that we might inherit nowadays, or the kind of the resources that you have within your broader extended family, actually count for a lot more nowadays than just the money that you might earn. So what this means is that somebody who, I'm going to be, playing your drinking game of a woke bingo here now, and I know I'm tapping out all the cliches, but somebody who kind of runs a little independent coffee shop, or a little microbrewery in a trendy part of London, but earns a pittance doing it, but is kind of quite secure in the knowledge that their mum and dad are going to be able to help them out if, come the end of the month, they are struggling to pay the rent, or, mum and dad may have actually been able to give them money to buy a house in that area, so they're actually not worrying about paying the rent, and they can afford to do the micro brewery or the coffee roasting thing, whatever it's called. But because they do that job, they think they are the true working class people. Whereas you saw with the Canadian lorry drivers protest, for example, back at the beginning of this year, how many on the left were very quick to write these lorry drivers off as, oh, they are the middle class, because don't you know they own these huge lorries? So, I go to work doing this microbrewery and have a house that's been bought for me by my mum and dad, but I'm the genuine working class. Whereas these people who are working kind of 16 hours a day, driving trucks, delivering vital goods from one part of the continent to the other, they're the upper class. It completely flips reality on its head. But then I think you add to that the layer of identity politics and this kind of beatification of victimhood status, if you like, where everybody wants to be a victim nowadays. And your person who's running the microbrewery or the coffee roasting company, who's also gay or black or transgender, they become at the very, very top of the hierarchy of oppression.
We talk about wokeness as an elite phenomenon, but maybe in some ways it's not. And there's two examples that I'll give you. The first is young people. I think young people are particularly attracted to this ideology, no matter who they are or their background. Maybe there's slight changes within, maybe outside of London or whatever, but I would say, this is just anecdotally, but almost all my friends and stuff, they're all kind of woke and they want to be moral and upright and everything else. So in that sense, maybe it's not so much of an elite phenomenon. And the other thing to point out is when the BLM protests, riots happened in 2020, and this idea of taking the knee became a hugely popular phenomenon. Most British people, if you looked at opinion polls, supported this, even though, as you rightly mention, BLM has some pretty extreme views. Its manifesto is revolutionary, etc. So maybe in some ways, wokeness is quite popular among the majority of the people. I've given you an example there, and particularly among young people.
Yeah, I think there's two different things going on there. I mean, I think, maybe I'm going to sound a bit patriotic here, I don't know. But I think British people generally, and I mean that in the broadest, most inclusive sense possible, I think we do have a very, very strong sense of fair play, of justice. As much as some white people might like to suggest otherwise, the people who I meet who are not woke explicitly, everybody, it seems to me, really, I don't meet racist people on a daily basis, I guess is what I'm trying to say. People are not racist. They're not sexist. People are aware that the times have changed, and people have a strong sense of what's right and wrong, of fairness and unfairness. And I think this really does extend into every area of people's lives, of everybody's lives. People have a very strong moral sense of fair play. And to me, I think that's one of the best things about the British character, if you like. And I think when people first hear then about George Floyd, somebody being killed at the hands of a police officer, your human instinct is to think, well, that's absolutely appalling. How could this have been allowed to happen? I want to do something to make it known that I object to this. And I think that's an entirely good and positive sense that people have, a really good, positive aspiration towards social justice. But I think the problem is that then gets exploited and twisted, and other meanings then get attributed to it. And then when people realise that these other kind of whole layers of meanings that they hadn't initially bought into are added on, and they then kind of put their hand up and raise questions. That's what, hang on a minute, why is my child being taught this at school? I'm not racist, but you're asking my children in my child's class to kind of list the reasons for their white privilege. Why is this happening? They then get labelled as racist for even questioning some of these basic assumptions, despite having this strong sense of fair play and justice and even equality, I would argue. But I think that's one thing. On young people, I really do think that there are some kind of quite major generational differences emerging, which I do think should concern us. And I think one of the reasons why this is happening is because woke is so dominant within the education system. And so I think what this means is that you've got an entire generation now of young people who've been through nursery, school, university, kind of being thoroughly imbued with woke thinking, either through just assemblies and the general culture of the school, or through the content of the curriculum in citizenship classes, PSHE classes, even geography, English lessons, and just kind of socialized into thinking that this is just kind of normal, acceptable thought. But I don't think that means that young people are kind of all irredeemably woke and for all times. I think it just means that most young people have never been given the opportunity to actually think critically about many of these things. And I think the two things together, this kind of innate sense of morality and fair play and justice, combined with never having been given an opportunity to think critically about where woke policymaking might lead to, I think does make young people inherently more likely to take these ideas and values on board. But I do think there is scope for kind of opening people's eyes a little bit and getting people to think critically about what's going on. And people, in my experience, do kind of respond well to that.
It's really interesting understanding or attempting to understand why young people do support wokeness and woke ideas. And I want to talk about three phenomenons or three values, and you mentioned one there, as to explain perhaps why this is going on. So the first one is morality. You talked about the sort of moral positioning of wokeness, it's very Christian, in a Christian way, of sort of positioning themselves as the anti-racist, the anti-homophobic, anti-fascist, whatever. And this is they're really taking the moral high ground. So that's one reason why one might be attracted to these ideas, and they're very simple ideas. The second reason is that these ideas have been presented as being anti-elite. As you say, the elites deny that they are the elites, and perhaps they take an old conservative elite that is long dead, that died decades and decades ago, and they still hold it up as this force that they are railing against. A bit like the French revolutionaries after the revolution, who carried on talking about the Catholic elites in France, even though they were long defeated. So these are two things. And then the third thing is the idea of status, and whether these ideas are high status or low status, and who's associated with woke ideas and anti-woke ideas. And by the anti-woke movement being largely made up of, let's say, tabloid journalism, of sort of shouty commentators, of kind of leave voting people, and I've got nothing against any of those people, by the way, but the way that they've perhaps presented themselves, or they are presented within society, isn't exactly the sort of the high status position that that celebrities hold or whatever. So can you talk about those three values that I just mentioned?
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is just that I think you're absolutely spot on with all of them. And if I could sum up kind of the argument for how woke won, I mean, that's you've summed it up in a nutshell. Woke has won because it has presented itself as being on the right side of history, as being the side that has the morally correct and upstanding position, and as being the kind of upstanding, the high status opinion. I think you're absolutely spot on all of those things, and I think it's absolutely true, if I was a young person growing up nowadays, coming out through university, I think I would definitely be wanting to identify myself with the people who were woke, because you'd be thinking, well, this is going to pave my way to get a good job, a kind of nice life for myself. Not only that, but an uncomplicated life. I won't be cancelled. I won't have to have arguments. I can sit in these training sessions in the workplace and I can just keep quiet and nod along. I don't need to stand up and put my head above the parapet. I don't need to attract trouble for myself. I just go along with the rituals. If they ask me to take the knee, it's far easier to go along with the performance, to take the knee, to be like everyone else, to fit in, to conform, than it is to stand out. And, that combined with exactly as you say, the way the kind of the other side, if you like, is presented as this unattractive, rabble, the masses, the unattractive masses that you don't want to be part of, I do think makes it very, very alluring. And, ultimately, I guess that is my argument as to why woke has won. But I don't want to sound defeatist about this. I think there is I think what woke has done very successfully is to hijack this rhetoric of anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, for example. But I think actually my side can really take the moral high ground if we can find the right arguments, the right words, because my big argument against the kind of the woke worldview, if you like, is not for one second that I want to be racist and sexist and homophobic. It's actually that I think that they are dressing up their racism, sexism and homophobia in the language of opposing it. So if you take racism, for example, if you go back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement, to me, the idea of being colorblind, the idea of judging people by the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, the idea of moving beyond race, of there being only one race, the human race, those were incredibly progressive ideas that could have seen us really transcend race altogether as a superficial category. No more than we have different colour hair, two people could have different colour skin. It would be completely, utterly irrelevant to somebody's self-worth, to somebody's idea of who they are. It's just a completely superficial feature. To me, that was something very, very positive in that. What's highly regressive, it seems to me, is this drive to get people to kind of rethink of themselves, to re-racialize society, to start with even the youngest children, categorizing people according to their skin color, separating them off, saying because your skin color is this, you must think this, you come with this sense of either inherent privilege or inherent disadvantage. And this is not just in relation to race, you see it in relation to gender, in relation to sexuality, where differences about people that should be minor, should be trivial, should be no more than a kind of point of interesting conversation in the pub, just make really minor about people, become the most important things that define who a person is. And all the old kind of prejudices that I really thought we were moving away from become reinvented and have new life breathed back into them. So even though I think woke thinking has kind of taken on that language and assumed the moral high ground, I actually think if we can find the right words, the right arguments, really push back, the moral high ground is there still to be won. There are some very, very good moral arguments to challenge woke thinking that we need to make sure get out there.
Now, I think, this is just my personal view, that the anti-woke movement has made these arguments consistently over the last few years, and they failed. And there's a sort of meme among kind of right-wing Twitter intellectuals that says the left are the real racists, and they're sort of, kind of being a bit satirical on like right-wing commentators or anti-woke commentators who would say, would start sort of, as I said earlier, sort of shock jocks kind of shouting this on the radio. And I think that message hasn't cut through, and this isn't a novel argument. People have been talking about this for a long time. Do you agree? Do you think the anti-woke movement has failed in this respect, despite making the argument? And why is that?
Well, I think there have been a number of important victories for the anti-woke movement. And, I think you can see those on a kind of individual level. I mean, and it's kind of another cliche to talk about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and we'll try and create it as more of a platform for free speech, we can hope. But you can look at other institutions as well, like the Free Speech Union, for example. Some of the stories that are highlighted, the very fact that the Telegraph on a daily basis highlights stories of kind of the detrimental impact that woke thinking is having within institutions. And I would put Spiked up with that as well as the online publication that really helps shine a spotlight on these things. And it seems to me that, I'm being very hypocritical because I've got a book called How Woke Won. But, whenever the spotlight of democracy is turned on woke thinking, people not only object to it, but are able to push back against it. Whenever these things are put to the public say no, and the public do push back against it. So despite having written a book called How Woke Won, I do think we can overstate it. I think it's won in capturing key institutions, but within the general population as a whole, I don't think woke has won. And I think the majority of people do challenge and think critically about these ideas. They just need more opportunity to be able to have their voices heard through referendums, votes, ballots, whatever it might be. And we need more organisations like the Free Speech Union, Spiked, the Telegraph, to shine a spotlight on what's going on, and then more opportunities for people to be able to put these things to have their say on what's going on, and you can really push back against it.
Many of the Conservatives who are against this cultural revolution that they've seen become very fatalistic and nihilistic about the future. They become what has been termed as doomers. Think of Peter Hitchens and other commentators. I can see that you're not a doomer. And I think there's also a certain level of intellectual snobbery, perhaps among Conservatives, sort of looking down on others. And maybe people could accuse me of doing that in my questions today. I don't know. So there's a bit of nuance here. Douglas Murray describes in his book, The War on the West, a sort of cultural revolution on what he sees as the West, but also white people specifically. Do you agree with him on his sort of thesis that this is a war on the West?
Well, I do, but it's a war on the West from within the West, and I think we've got to be careful about that. It's not it's not a war that's coming from the outside where we've got an external enemy. The enemy is within, if you like. I've got to confess I've not read Douglas Murray's book yet, but I also guess, without wanting to predict, that is the point that he's making, that this is a kind of an enemy within. This is our biggest problem at the moment is self-loathing, is self-hatred. And, again, one of the reasons why I'm not a doomster is if you look at, say, the Jubilee celebrations that we've just had this weekend, I'm a Republican, I'm not a monarchist at all, but I was still out there kind of enjoying the 4 days off, glass of Prosecco, nice slice of cake, it's good. And I think the thing that showed me was that these national occasions have the power to bring people together in this country a lot more than your identity politics does. So, we're in Pride Month. Pride will be a massive thing coming from all our, national institutions again, but also, I live in Canterbury. If I walk down Canterbury High Street now, I'm sure my bank will be having a rainbow flag outside, Marks and Spencer's will have its rainbow flag. But that doesn't have the same capacity to pull together people across generational differences, across different parts of the UK, and the Jubilee celebrations, even if you're not a monarchist like me, there's something in that national identity that is able to bring people together, that shows that this enemy within, if you like, this national self-loathing, I think is a real elite preoccupation. The party poopers who were sat there this weekend saying, oh, this is all the plebs having a cheap jolly, isn't it all a bit tacky and yucky? They were the ones who lost out. They missed an opportunity to have a bit of good fun, and meet their neighbours, have a bit of a community get together, share in some common sense of celebration, which I think was a really worthwhile, good thing to do.
Let's briefly talk about social media. You mentioned Elon Musk earlier. It's obviously a place where, let's say, even a majority of the debates around the culture wars are taking place. Have you noticed a shift in the left's or the kind of woke's view of social media over the last decade? Because in 2008, it was lauded as this great output, Facebook was specifically, for Barack Obama to get elected, and it was seen as this fantastic new medium for people to find truth and speak truth to power and whatever. And then in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected, it was seen as the new purporter of disinformation by the Russians, by propaganda, by lies, which sort of hoodwinked people into voting for Brexit and Trump. So have you noticed an interesting shift in their views towards social media platforms?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the takeover by Elon Musk has been so interesting, irrespective of whatever happens next, even if he drops the whole thing and it doesn't actually happen, because I think it really provided a moment of clarity where people came out with some very, very explicit statements about the horror, the potential horror that might be unleashed if we actually have free speech on Twitter. And how can we make this stop? This would be the most terrible thing. And I think it kind of revealed again, as I was saying earlier, the kind of contempt that many of the woke left have for ordinary people, because the only way that they seem to be able to conceive of free speech is now as hate speech. I think when I was younger, that phrase hate speech didn't even really exist. People said bad things, and there was, you could say, hateful, horrible things, but the kind of the phrase hate speech as such just didn't really exist. Whereas now it seems like free speech and hate speech are seen as being completely synonymous with one another. The only thing people would want to do if they were given free speech would be to unleash this bile and hatred, and spread misinformation. And then it almost seems to be in some people's minds as if they've drawn a foregone conclusion that you have free speech and then Trump will obviously be re-elected. If he immediately gets back onto Twitter, he will be re-elected. I mean, if nothing else, to me, that really shows their own insecurities and the weaknesses that they have in their own arguments, because to me, free speech is the great leveler. If I have free speech, then you have free speech. If I disagree with you, I can use my free speech to argue against you, but you can also argue against me. The only reason why you would want censorship in that context is if you have absolutely no faith in the power of your own arguments to convince anyone of anything. And I think the rumoured takeover by Elon Musk really unleashed that sense, where people were making it very explicit. Well, we can't possibly argue back or have anything to say to these people, so we must just restrict their free speech. I think the other thing it did very, very nicely, but also quite scarily, is show the relationship between kind of private sector, big business, and the state, and how these two things now move hand in hand to bring about censorship. How there's not that clear distinction. How private companies like Twitter and Facebook are very happy to parcel out censorship to the state when it suits them. But absolutely, it works the other way around as well. The state is very, very happy to have private companies like Twitter enacting their own censorship policies, so the state can appear to be taking a back seat. And almost as soon as it appeared that Twitter might not be censoring quite as much as it has been in the past, you got calls on the state to step up to the plate, to bring in more things like the online harms bill, online safety bill that we know is coming in the UK, but also from the US and the EU, for governments to institutions to step up and start regulating even more. So I thought for those two reasons, it was a very clarifying thing. And you're right, the whole discourse around social media has completely changed.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for joining us. Completely enlightening conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Some really thought-provoking questions really made me think. Thank you.